So, today, given that disgustingly Christmas products are already in the shops, it seems just about time that I can start addressing where major Christian festivals came from. Were they stolen from the pagans? Were they created to cover over pagan worship? Or were they perhaps created to go undercover, celebrating Christian things at the same time as pagans to avoid persecution? Certainly there's a lot of pop theology and nonsense online around this very topic, and helpfully we're at just the right era in church history to start addressing it. And we begin with a character called Melito of Sardis. Now, Melito was Bishop of Sardis, surprise, surprise, in western modern day Turkey. And no, we don't know when he was born. We know that he died around about AD 180. Now, Melito was a prolific author and a widely respected figure. So respected that many people by the medieval era had started to use his name to put it on their own writings to give them more authority, a practice called pseudepigraphy, from which we get the term writing under a pseudonym or writing under an alias. And that's a problem we've already discussed with the likes of the Epistle of Barnabas and the wider canon of Ignatius. Now, Melito, nonetheless, in his many works which he did write, was a skilled apologist. He wrote to Emperor Marcus Aurelius to defend the Christian faith against a common practice under imperial decrees of not so much killing Christians, although that was still happening, but the widespread use of these imperial edicts to allow local authorities to tax Christians into poverty or outright take their money, take their property, take anything that they wanted. As far as Melito was concerned, Rome was flourishing. Just look at Emperor Hadrian before and how vastly the empire expanded under his rule. Christianity was growing, but it's no threat to the Roman Empire, so you really can just leave it alone. We're good citizens. He's also famous for being the first Christian to explicitly write a canon of the Old Testament, containing those books in the Old Testament that should be acceptable to all Christians. And if you've been following in this church history series, I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that this was written in the context of refuting Marcion. Anyone who is anyone in the church wrote books refuting Marcion. Marcion disavowed the entire Old Testament as being irrelevant to Christians. Interestingly, Melito's Old Testament is almost exactly what you would find in Protestant Bibles today, or Hebrew Bibles today. The entire Old Testament without the Apocrypha, or what you might call the Deuterocanonical books, with one exception. Melito also didn't have in his Bible the book of Esther. That Esther is missing is surprising, but perhaps shouldn't be too surprising. It doesn't mention God, and we know that even around the time of Jesus, Jews were still debating how really this should be inside their Bible. Melito himself, being born a Jew, helps explain his position on this. Interestingly, Athanasius, a name we're going to become very familiar with in a few weeks' time, writing at the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century, would likewise reject the Book of Esther and almost all the Deuterocanonical or apocryphal books, the same as Melito when he brings together his canon of the Bible. One reason, though, that we don't have many of the works of Melito, despite knowing he wrote many, is that, although sainted, unlike our friend Tertullian, he found himself on the wrong side of history when it comes to the question of when Christians should celebrate Easter, which leads nicely into a controversy with an epic name, the Quartodeciman Controversy. The Quartodeciman Controversy. This word is taken from the Latin for the number 14, because Quartodecimans, like Melito, insisted that the Apostle John had told Polycarp, who ultimately had passed it on to them, but the resurrection of Jesus should be specifically celebrated by Christians on 14 Nisan of the Jewish calendar, the same day as Jewish Passover. So in Western Anatolia, Western modern-day Turkey, the church celebrated what we call Easter, based on the Jewish lunar calendar, on 14 Nisan. But in the West, in Rome and in most of Greece, and also further east in Palestine, in Armenia and in Egypt, they came to celebrate Easter not on 14 Nisan, but on the first Lord's Day, or Sunday, following 14 Nisan, claiming that this was the tradition they inherited from Peter and Paul and the likes of James. And so on the borders between these areas, you could have the ridiculous situation, seemingly, of Christians celebrating Easter on different days, one on maybe Thursday, one on Sunday. And this caused scandal. It was seen to be bringing discredit to the name of Christianity. But it wasn't a new problem. From what we understand, this was an issue already known about when Polycarp visited Rome before the martyrdom of Ignatius and Polycarp himself. But they agreed they could differ on this because they were united on the core of the faith. Pope Victor of Rome in AD 190 didn't agree. He got so angry at these Quartodecimans celebrating Easter on 14 Nisan that he threatened to excommunicate them from the church. Our good friend Irenaeus, however, told him that that was stupid and he should go take a walk, cool down, reflect on life and what's actually important, what really matters. And thankfully, he listened to this sage advice, although the Eastern churches would have just ignored him anyway at this time. Nonetheless, at the turn of the century, around AD 190 and that following decade, there were various local church councils, local synods in Pontus, that's the northern point of modern-day Turkey, in Palestine and Armenia, as well as in Gaul, that's modern-day France, and in Rome itself, which did say we're having a unified celebration on the Lord's Day, not whatever day 14 Nisan happens to be. Although some Quartodecimans did continue, likely even into the 5th century, the issue was nearly universally settled at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. And this is the first time I believe I've mentioned this council. And if there were ever to be a test, don't worry, there won't be, but if there were ever to be a test on church history, the single most important date to remember and burn into your brain, Council of Nicaea, AD 325. At Nicaea, they decided to use the Roman Julian calendar instead of the Jewish one, as the Roman one was based on astronomical spring equinox and thus easier to work out. And they also said, we're going to do this on the Sunday following when Passover would be celebrated on the Julian calendar. You'd think that was the end, everyone using the Julian calendar. But no, you would actually be mistaken. Let's, for a moment, skip forward nearly 300 years from the Council of Nicaea, which was in AD 325. And in Britain, AD 604, we find the Synod of Whitby. Now, Britain at the time was split into two branches, two kinds of Christianity. The Ionian Christianity, also known today as Celtic Christianity, and the Roman Christianity, which was rapidly expanding its influence across these isles. And the issue came to a head in the court of the Northumbrian king Oziwiu, and his wife Eanfled. And they celebrated Easter on different days, which caused havoc with all the fasting around Lent leading up to Easter in the imperial court. You had one person celebrating and their household and their servants stopping fasting before the other. The problem was that the Ionian Christians used an old method of calculating Easter dating from AD 410, whilst the Romans had started using a more scientific method, a new one similar to those in Alexandria, which had been introduced by papal edicts by AD 525. At the Synod of Whitby, things were decided in favour of the Roman system. And here we begin to see the major power plays by the Bishop of Rome to assert dominance over all of Western Christianity. Something very different from the time of Melito in 190 or so AD, or whatever the Pope said then, which would largely just be ignored by other churches. The Church in Europe from this point on, from the time of the Synod of Whitby, would celebrate Easter together until 1582 AD, when Pope Gregory gave us what is known as the Gregorian calendar, which now the entire world uses on all of our calendars and all of our apps and everything that we use. Except for the Eastern Orthodox churches, who steadfastly continue to use the old Julian calendar, which has slowly but surely gotten more and more out of sync, such that nowadays you might celebrate Easter at an Eastern Orthodox church and a week or so later celebrate it at an Anglican church or a Roman Catholic church or any other church from Western Europe. Something I took full advantage of when I was in Oxford. Now, in all of that discussion about the date of Easter, from the time of the Quartodeciman Controversy all the way through to the Synod of Whitby in 600 or so AD, all the way through to the 1500s, there is nothing that hints at Christians picking the date they did, either to coincide with popular pagan festivals to avoid persecution, or the stealing of pagan festivals and imposing Christianity on top of them. Easter was clearly a completely internal matter, only to do with a debate around apostolic tradition over the date on which to celebrate it, with regards to the Jewish Passover. We might call this festival Easter in England, and yes, that is the name of a pagan god, Eoster, but it's only called that because the name of the month of April, when Easter nearly always fell in England at the time, was Easter. It's the name of the month in which the celebration was taking place. Even today, we have many months named after pagan gods: January, March, April, May, June. Likewise, every day of the week which we use is named after a pagan god. That doesn't mean that our calendar or our doing things in those months or our speaking of days of the week has anything to do with actual paganism, and neither does Easter. But what about Christmas? Whilst the Bible does speak somewhat about celebrating Easter, inasmuch as every Sunday is the Lord's Day, when the church met because it's the day of the resurrection and they met to celebrate the resurrection of the Lord, there's no mention of a Christmas festival in itself in the Bible. So where did it come from? When is it first mentioned? Christians don't seem to have favoured celebrating birthdays for the first 200 or 300 years of the church, seeing it as a self-indulgent pagan practice. But by the mid-4th century, Christmas appears to be a thing. Nonetheless, even if it's not a celebration, the date of the birth of Jesus was widely discussed long before the date when it became a church festival. In the East, the church held that the apostles told them to celebrate the birth of Christ on the 6th of January. The birth of Jesus being on the 6th of January is recorded by Clement of Alexandria in the late 2nd century. In the West, the apostles are so allegedly saying to celebrate it on December the 25th, 12 days earlier than the 6th of January, almost like the 12 days of Christmas. The December the 25th date is mentioned first by Hippolytus of Rome in the early 200s AD. The earliest and most consistent and widely held dates given for the birth of Jesus by these earliest Christian writers are all mid-winter, all of which has absolutely nothing to do with paganism. The reality is that the stories you might hear online or peddled by ignorant people are utter bumpkus. Now, there's often two main lines of argument you might hear about how allegedly Christianity copied other religions, and none of it's real, including the date of Christmas. The first of these is to do with the Egyptian god Horus. It's claimed that Horus was born on the 25th of December, born of a virgin, baptized by someone called Anup the Baptizer, was crucified and resurrected 3 days later. But literally none of that is true at all. There is no reference in Egyptian mythology to any of this. His mother was Isis, who was certainly not a virgin when she was impregnated by her husband's prosthetic golden penis. There's no record anywhere in the Egyptian texts of an Anup the Baptizer, who was invented by a 19th century English poet called Gerald Massey, who likewise invented this idea that Horus had 12 disciples. Horus could not have been crucified, as crucifixion was not invented when the Horus mythos was being made. It was an invention of the Persians, where you were crucified to a stake, and it was later perfected by the Romans, doing it on a cross. Likewise, Horus was not resurrected from the dead after crucifixion and dying for the sins of others, but rather in his mythos, his being brought back to life in his story occurred when he was a child, because his mother was very upset and went to the animal-headed god of magic. There's no evidence of any festival of Horus on the 25th of December. The bottom line is that desperately trying to find parallels between Horus mythos, which evolved over a 5,000 year period, and the biblical account of Jesus is unsupported by any serious academic. And they're the people you should be looking to when questioning these things, not the likes of a comedian called Bill Maher or an English poet called Gerald Massey and his contemporaries. So that's the Horus mythos. The second common line taken is that Christianity actually stole their ideas from the Roman mystery cult of Mithras. Now, Mithraism started in the East, inspired by Persian Zoroastrianism, and it merged with Greek and Roman ideas under Alexander the Great and his successors. Some people claim that Mithras was born of a virgin on the 25th of December. He had 12 disciples whom he gave a special meal consisting of his body and his blood. It's remarkable, but not a single word of what I just said is true. Mithras was not born by a virgin. He wasn't even born from a woman. He was born from a rock. He had 2 disciples, not 12. And the Mithraic meal was not even with his 2 disciples, but as a sun god with another sun god having a feast over the flesh of a bull, not the flesh of Mithras himself. But even if there were some truth in all of this, Mithraism was very thinly spread across the empire. It was a mystery religion that very few people knew much about. The biblical accounts of Jesus and the Last Supper and the 12 disciples, the virgin birth, the crucifixion and resurrection, all predate possible contact with the cult of Mithras. The reality is if there was any impact and influence going on, it would have been Christianity impacting the cult of Mithras and not the other way around. But what of the claims that Mithras was born on the 25th of December? This likewise is actually unproven. There's no evidence at all directly that Mithras was born on the 25th of December or that his followers celebrated his birth on that date. Rather, it was the Roman god Sol Invictus who was born and whose celebration was on that day. And though these two are sun gods and they somewhat merged in some of the mystery cults, there's no direct evidence that the Mithrites ever adopted the 25th as a celebration of the birth of Mithras. Indeed, in Persia, where Mithras myth first originated, the birth of Mithras was and is celebrated on the 21st of December, the eve of the actual winter solstice. So there's not even a match-up there. So, again, just like with Horus, there is no evidence that Christmas had anything to do with Mithras. Other alleged connections, like to the Norse god Balder, are likewise found wanting, as there were hundreds of years between the birth of Christianity and the writing of Balder's mythos by the Norse. In a similar vein, the Christian traditions around Christmas all began in the Eastern Mediterranean, far away from any Celtic gods and goddesses. Though the tidy rounding up of dates and associations between Jesus and the Son no doubt led in part to the universal adoption of the 25th of December as the day when Christians would celebrate the birth of Christ, the reality is that from the 2nd century onwards, long before, centuries before, there was any actual Christian festival celebrating Christmas, the church was already largely agreed on a mid-winter date for the birth of Christ between the 25th of December and the 6th of January. And that covers this topic today, the interesting character of Melito and his impact on the church, especially around the writing of the Old Testament canon, but also the Quartodeciman Controversy, the history of the date of Easter, and why even today the church no longer celebrates it on the same day. And of course, Christmas and why it's celebrated on the 25th of December.